3 days after the funeral, Julian Vance handed Martha a cardboard box and a 24-hour notice to vacate. Martha stood in the foyer of the house she had lived in for 28 years. The same foyer where she had hung Christmas wreaths. The same foyer where she had welcomed grandchildren. The same foyer where Arthur had taken her hand on their wedding day and smiled like a man still surprised that life had given him love twice. Now his son was standing in that same place telling her to leave. Julian was Arthur's son from his first marriage, and he had never once called Martha anything but Martha. Martha looked at the cardboard box, then at Julian. Her hand rested lightly on the banister, not because she was weak, but because some humiliations deserve balance, not reaction. She said nothing. Arthur's children had already taken control of everything that mattered on paper. The house, the cars, the accounts, the investment portfolio, all of it sat inside a trust Martha could not touch. The attorneys had explained it in the polished, careful language of people who deliver damage without ever appearing cruel. Martha had listened. She had thanked them, and she had gone home to pack. To Julian and his sister she was not a widow. She was a temporary presence whose time had run out. But on the morning she was supposed to leave, Martha removed the last books from Arthur's study and noticed something she had somehow never seen before. Taped behind his old high school track photograph, the one that had hung on the wall for decades, was a small brass key. She froze. 2 days earlier, she had watched Julian try to force open the locked bottom drawer of Arthur's desk. He had tried keys from Arthur's ring, then a letter opener, then anger. The drawer had not opened. Now Martha stood alone in the study, the tiny brass key resting in her palm. Same length, same cut, same shape. And for the first time since the funeral, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Arthur had not left everything to chance. He had left something for her, and Julian had never found it. The silence after a funeral is never empty. It has weight, the specific uneven weight of a presence removed from a space it occupied for a long time. You feel it in the rooms, in the quality of morning light that falls differently now on surfaces that used to be warmed by someone's movement through them, in the chair that sits at the wrong angle because no one has sat in it since he did, in the kitchen where the coffee is made for one now and the extra cup is still in the cabinet and you are not yet ready to decide what to do about that. Martha had been living inside that silence for 3 days when Julian and Chloe arrived. They came before 9 in the morning, Julian with his briefcase and Chloe with her notepad, moving through the front door with the particular energy of people who have decided that a difficult thing needs to be done efficiently and that efficiency is a form of respect, or at least a substitute for it. The sound of the briefcase latches, the scrape of a chair pulled back from Arthur's dining table without ceremony, the snap of a document folder being opened. Martha sat at the long table and watched Julian set papers in front of her. She had her hands folded the way she had always sat in difficult meetings during the years she had administered a school district board's budgets, parents with grievances, the occasional conversation that required her to absorb something painful and respond without flinching. She had learned in those years that stillness in a difficult room was not passivity. It was its own kind of power. Julian explained the trust deed with the clip precision of a man who has been briefed and is now briefing. An estate attorney, not Edward Sloan, not the man Arthur had trusted for 30 years, but a different attorney, a man Martha had never heard Arthur mention, had reviewed the primary trust instrument. It had been established before Arthur's marriage to Martha. It had not been amended in a way that altered the core distribution. The house and all its contents passed to the blood heirs upon Arthur's death. Julian and Chloe were co-trustees with full administrative authority. Martha asked one question, whether Edward Sloan had been consulted. Julian said that Edward Sloan's role had been superseded by the trust instrument. Martha looked at him for a moment. Then she thanked him and waited for him to continue. Julian leaned back in his chair. Then he stood and moved to Arthur's desk in the study doorway, resting one hand on the frame in the proprietary way of a man taking measure of what he now considers his. He said, "You were the companion, Martha, but the legacy that belongs to the Vances." He said it without particular cruelty, which was she had found often the worst way for cruel things to be said. as if it were simply a clarification, a correction of a misunderstanding she might have been harboring. She said nothing. Chloe had brought sticky notes. Pink ones small, the kind used in offices for quick sorting. She moved through the rooms with the focused efficiency of a woman who has already made her decisions and is now recording them for others to execute. Martha watched from the hallway as Chloe pressed a note to the sideboard, sell, another to the hall mirror, keep, another to the bookshelf in the sitting room. Donate check editions first. Then Chloe came to the sitting room and looked at the porcelain vase on the side table. The cream-colored vase with the hand-painted blue flowers that Arthur had carried from the shop himself on their first anniversary, because he had said he didn't want it wrapped in paper by a stranger. He wanted to bring it himself. And he had set it on that table and said, "This is where it lives now." And she had laughed and loved him for the certainty of it. Chloe pressed a pink note to the vase. It said donation. Martha said from the doorway, "That was a gift to me, from Arthur, on our first anniversary." Chloe looked up. She said, "Do you have documentation? A card? A receipt?" Martha said it was 27 years ago. Chloe peeled the note off and pressed a different one in its place. This one said estate pending review, as if the change were a concession, as if pending review were a kindness rather than a delay of the same outcome. Martha went to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and looked out at the garden, the rose bed along the south wall, the kitchen herbs near the back step, the old oak at the property line that had been growing since before either of them and would still be growing after. She pressed her palms flat on the counter and let herself feel the solid surface of it, the familiar edge of a counter she had stood at 10,000 mornings. Arthur's fountain pen was on the counter. She didn't know how it had gotten there. Perhaps she had brought it from the study without thinking, the way you carry things belonging to someone you love, without accounting for the motion. She picked it up. It was dry. The ink had run out some time ago, and he had not refilled it, and now it never would be. She held it for a moment. This pen that had signed documents and written letters and left small notes on the kitchen counter for 28 years, "Dear M, gone to the hardware store back by noon," was empty now. His voice in ink silenced. She set it carefully in her cardigan pocket. Julian reappeared in the kitchen doorway. He told her she could take her clothes, her toiletries, her personal books. He told her that anything else required inventory review before it left the house. He told her the piano stays. She said, "The piano is mine. I purchased it in 1989 before I knew Arthur." He said, "We'll need documentation." She said, "I have the receipt." He said they would review it. His tone suggested the review would be thorough. Then he walked to Arthur's study. She followed without announcing herself and stood in the doorway. Julian was at the desk, the old walnut desk Arthur had refinished himself, the one that had sat in the same position for 28 years, with the same lamp and the same leather blotter and the same row of reference books along the back edge. Julian had Arthur's keyring and was working through the keys methodically, trying each one in the lock of the bottom right drawer. Martha had not thought about that drawer in years. It had always been locked as long as she could remember. Arthur had never made a point of the lock. He had never drawn attention to it. It had simply been a feature of the desk, like the brass handles or the worn edge on the left side where he always rested his elbow, part of the furniture unremarked. Julian tried the fourth key, the fifth. He picked up the letter opener from the desktop and worked it into the gap above the drawer, applying leverage. The drawer did not move. He stood back. He looked at the drawer with the expression of a man recalibrating the amount of effort he is willing to invest in an obstacle. Then he brought the side of his fist down on the desktop once with the controlled frustration of someone who has decided to express just enough feeling to release pressure without losing composure. He said, "Old junk?" He set the keyring down and walked out. Martha stood in the study alone. She looked at the desk, at the locked drawer undisturbed, at the keyring Julian had left on the blotter, at the high school track photograph on the wall, Arthur at 17 mid-stride, the finish line ahead of him, that particular expression of concentrated effort that she had recognized the first time she saw it as the same expression he wore when he was working on something that mattered. She had dusted that frame 100 times. She had looked past it while looking for other things. She had never looked at it directly, not in the specific way of a person considering what might be behind it. She crossed the room. She lifted the frame from its nail and turned it over. Taped to the backing with a single strip of yellowed tape was a small brass key. Small, specific, the particular cut of a key made for one lock and no other. She looked at the drawer. She looked at the key. She heard his voice, not chosen, not summoned, but arriving the way his voice arrived sometimes in the rooms he had occupied, unbidden and unmistakable. "I've spent my life building walls, Martha. I made sure these ones would always protect you." She had sat beside him in this study in the last weeks when the illness had made him too tired for anywhere but the chair by the window, and he had looked toward the desk with an expression she had understood as fatigue. She understood it differently now. He had been looking at the drawer. He had been thinking about time, about whether there was enough of it left to say what needed saying. There had not been enough time, so he had done the next best thing. She took the key from the backing of the photograph and closed her fingers around it. She could hear Julian and Chloe in the dining room, the sound of the briefcase, the tear of a sticky note from its pad, the categorical efficiency of people processing a life they had never properly understood into columns they could manage. She put the key in her cardigan pocket beside the dry fountain pen. She picked up a stack of books from the shelf and placed them in the cardboard box and went on packing steadily, without expression, without any outward sign of what she was carrying. Because what she was carrying now was not in the box. It was in her pocket. And Julian had already decided it was old junk. The house was quiet by 11. Julian and Chloe had gone to a hotel. Julian had mentioned it with the slight emphasis of a man who wanted her to understand that he was not sleeping under a roof. He now considered his own as a courtesy to her, which told her a great deal about how he had arranged the situation in his own mind. She had thanked him for the consideration without inflection, and closed the front door and stood in the entry hall for a moment, listening to the silence settle back into the rooms, the way silence does when difficult people have finally left.
She had one more night.
She had used the evening hours to pack the practical things, her clothes, her files, the contents of her nightstand, the items from the bathroom that were unambiguously hers. She had moved through those tasks with the focused economy of a woman who has learned over a long life that the way to manage overwhelming things is to break them into the next specific action, and then the one after that, without looking at the whole of it all at once. Now it was 11 o'clock, and the practical things were done, and what remained was the study. She had been saving it, not avoiding it. She was too honest with herself to call it that. Saving it. The study was where Arthur had been most fully himself, and she had wanted to come to it last when the house was quiet, and Julian and Chloe were elsewhere, and she could be in that room without anyone else's presence competing with his. She turned on the desk lamp only. The small pool of warm light it cast was enough. It was the same light Arthur had worked by on 1,000 evenings, and it felt right to use no more than he had used. She began with the bookshelves. She was not taking the books Julian's inventory, held them as household contents, and she had decided not to fight that particular battle, not tonight, not for these. Arthur would have told her not to fight for the books. He would have said something precise and slightly oblique about the difference between the vessel and what it carried, and she would have understood him and let the books go. She was taking the photographs. They were hers in the only way that mattered, not legally, not documentably, but in the way that photographs of a shared life belonged to the people who lived it. She lifted them from the shelves one by one, wrapping each in the tissue paper she had brought for the purpose, setting them in the box with the care of someone handling things that cannot be replaced. She came to the track photograph last. Arthur at 17, mid-stride, the finish line ahead of him. She had always loved this photograph, not for its sentiment, but for its specificity, the way it captured something true about him, the particular quality of his focused attention, the expression of a man who has identified what he is moving toward and has committed to the motion completely. She had recognized that expression the first time she met him decades later and had thought, I know this person. I know how he moves through the world. She lifted the frame from the wall, she wrapped it in tissue, and as she did, something registered the slight resistance of the backing, a stiffness that was not the natural weight of glass and cardboard. She had handled enough frame photographs over the years to know what they felt like, and this one felt different, thicker at the back than it should be. She set it on the desk under the lamp. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned it over. The backing was cardboard, the standard kind that came with frames of this era pressed slightly brown, with age held in place by small metal tabs bent flat against the frame's edge. She used her thumbnail to lift the tabs one by one and remove the backing. Between the cardboard and the photograph's reverse taped flat with a single strip of tape that had aged to the color of old honey was a small brass key, and beside it, written on the cardboard in Arthur's handwriting, small, deliberate, in the blue ink of the fountain pen she now carried in her cardigan pocket. "Check the bottom, Ellie. Always check the bottom." She stood very still. Ellie. He had called her that in private, only in private, a shortening of her middle name that had begun as a joke and become over 28 years the name he used when he was being most himself with her, when the careful, composed exterior that Arthur presented to the world was set aside, and it was just the two of them in a room together, being honestly who they were. Julian had never heard him use that name. Chloe had never heard it. It was not in any document or letter or card he had ever written for anyone else's eyes. He had written it here because he had known that only she would find this, and he had wanted her to know the moment she read it that what she had found was meant for her, specifically, and no one else. She sat down in his chair. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, not to stop sound, but simply to do something with the feeling that had arrived, the complicated, overwhelming thing that was grief and gratitude and love and loss, all arriving simultaneously the way they do when you are sitting in a dead man's chair, holding a note he wrote to you in the handwriting. You would know anywhere, in the name that belonged only to the two of you. Always check the bottom. She had heard him say those words before. Not about this, about wood. They had been in the garden one spring afternoon years ago, transplanting a rose that had not been thriving, and he had crouched beside the root ball and shown her something in the lower roots, a grub infestation that was invisible from the surface. He had said, "The most important things are never on the surface, Martha. Always check the bottom." She had not known hearing it then that she was also being told something else. She stood up. She crossed to the desk and looked at the locked bottom right drawer and placed the small brass key in the lock. It turned. The drawer opened. She stood for a moment looking at what was inside without touching it. Not from fear, from the same instinct that had made her save the study for last, the instinct that certain moments deserve a full second of recognition before they become actions. Inside the drawer, a blue ledger, the kind with a cloth cover, and ruled pages, the kind used for careful record-keeping. Beneath it, a stack of papers she could not yet identify. And on top of everything, placed deliberately where it would be seen first, a sealed envelope. The envelope was addressed in Arthur's handwriting. Not to her. To Edward Sloane. She picked it up and looked at it. Edward Sloane, Arthur's attorney, his old friend, the man Julian had told her in passing, had retired and moved away some time ago. She had accepted this information at the time, without examining it the way you accept information delivered casually by someone who appears to have no reason to deceive you. She thought about that now, about the casual delivery, about the specific information retired moved away that would discourage her from trying to reach him, about the fact that Julian had hired a different attorney to handle the estate, and had mentioned Edward Sloane only in the context of his absence, and had said it in the same tone he used for other things he considered settled. She thought about Arthur's face in his final weeks turned toward the study, trying to find the words that the illness had taken from him too early. She thought about the name Ellie written in blue ink in a frame that had hung on this wall for as long as she had been in this house. She looked at the envelope in her hand, at Edward Sloane's name. She set it carefully on top of the ledger and closed the drawer without locking it, and sat back in Arthur's chair under the single warm circle of the desk lamp. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the house, the sudden specific sound of settling timber, the language of old houses in the hours when no one is moving through them. Her heart moved first. Then she listened, and the house was still, and she understood it was only the structure doing what structures do in the quiet dark. She breathed. She thought about what Julian had said about Edward Sloane, retired, moved away, said in the easy, incidental tone of a man providing context rather than argument, which was exactly how you would say something you wanted someone to accept without questioning. She opened her phone. She typed the name into the search bar. Edward Sloane, attorney, the county name. The results came back in seconds. Edward Sloane Estate and Property Law. An address in the county seat 12 miles away. A phone number, a website that had been updated 3 months ago. Not retired. Not moved away.
Right here.
She looked at the sealed envelope on the desk in front of her, at Arthur's handwriting, at the name of the man Julian had told her was gone. She said quietly to the empty study, to the lamp and the dark bookshelves and the space where a man had sat for 28 years, being carefully, methodically, lovingly himself.
You never did anything without a reason, did you, Arthur? It was not a question.
She already knew the answer. The rain arrived before dawn. Martha heard it before she was fully awake, the particular sound of a cold spring rain on the study window, the one she had slept near for 28 years, the one that looked out over the rose bed Arthur had planted the summer after they married. She had slept in the chair in the study, rather than the bedroom, which she had not made a decision about, so much as found herself doing the way you find yourself doing things in grief that make a different kind of sense than ordinary sense. She was already dressed when Julian knocked at 8 o'clock. He stood in the doorway with his collar turned up against the rain, his expression carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who has decided that this morning is a transaction and intends to complete it on schedule. He told her his movers were available to take her boxes to the apartment. It was a generous offer, he said, simpler for everyone. Martha looked at him. She understood what the offer was. She had administered a school district for 20 years. She had sat across from people who were doing 2 things at once, saying one thing and accomplishing another, and she had learned to read the gap between them with some precision. Julian wanted his movers in her boxes. He wanted eyes on what she was taking out of the house. The generosity was a search conducted at his expense. She said, "Thank you, Julian. I'll manage my own boxes." He looked at her for a moment with the slight recalibration of a man whose offer has been declined in a way that doesn't give him anything to argue with. Then he said the movers were there regardless, and it was no trouble. She said she appreciated it and began carrying boxes to her car herself steadily, one at a time, with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has decided how this morning will go. The blue ledger was at the bottom of her larger suitcase beneath her winter sweaters wrapped in a pillowcase. The sealed envelope addressed to Edward Sloane was folded inside the ledger. The brass key was in her cardigan pocket alongside Arthur's dry fountain pen. Julian watched her load the car. He did not help. He stood on the porch in the rain with his hands in his coat pockets and watched with the patient attention of a man cataloging what he sees, and she let him watch because there was nothing to see that would tell him anything useful. When the last box was loaded, she closed the trunk. She walked back to the front door. She stood in the foyer for a moment, the foyer where the Christmas wreaths had hung and the grandchildren had arrived, and Arthur had taken her hand on their wedding day, with that expression of a man who could not quite believe his good fortune. She said, "Goodbye, Julian." She did not say goodbye to the house. The house already knew. She got in the car and drove. She did not go to the apartment. The apartment was real. She had found it online the previous week. A small place in the next town, functional and affordable, and entirely without the quality of a place she intended to stay long. She had given Julian the address because it was a real address, and because giving him a real address was simpler than explaining that she had other plans for the morning. She drove through the rain with the ledger in her suitcase in the trunk, and Arthur's voice somewhere in the background of her, thinking the way it had been since she found the key. Not loud, not intrusive, just present the way the voices of people we have loved for a long time become part of the way we think, indistinguishable after enough years from our own internal voice. If the main light goes out, look for the smaller one. It will still lead you home. He had said that on the coast years ago, one of their early trips together before they were married, when they were still in the slightly astonished phase of two people who have found each other later than expected and are making up for lost time. They had been standing outside a lighthouse at dusk, and the main lamp had been doing its slow rotation, and Arthur had pointed to a smaller fixed light lower on the structure, the kind used for close navigation rather than open water. He had said, that smaller one is often more useful than the big one. It's the one that tells you where you actually are. She had thought he was talking about lighthouses. She had driven 2 hours through the coastal rain before she found the address. Edward Sloane's office was in a building that had been other things before it was an office, a house perhaps, or a shop, something with a domestic scale that legal practice had moved into rather than built for. The sign on the door was small, the lettering plain, Edward Sloane, attorney at law. Established practice, not the office of a man who had retired or moved away, the office of a man who was still working, still present, still at the address that an internet search returned in 4 seconds. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and went inside. He was older than she remembered from the one occasion she had met him, Arthur's retirement dinner 7 years ago, a brief introduction in a crowded room. He had a quality of organized dishevelment that reminded her of people who think too specifically to attend to general appearances. His desk was covered in files, his bookshelves crowded past their capacity stacks of folders on the floor. Beside his chair, arranged with an order that was probably legible only to him. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and is now recalibrating the fact of its arrival. He said, "Martha Vance." She said, "Julian told me you had retired, that you'd moved away." He said, "Julian wanted me gone, Martha. There's a difference." She sat down in the chair across from his desk. He told her the rest of it plainly, the way she had already come to understand Edward Sloane communicated without performance, without the managed delivery of difficult information, just the facts in the order they needed to be in. 3 years ago, Julian had come to his office, not about Arthur's health, not about estate planning in the normal course. Julian had come with a specific request that a particular file in Edward's records, a file pertaining to a trust amendment Arthur had executed, be handled in a way that made it effectively inaccessible. He had used careful language. He had not used the word destroy. He had said misplace and manage and simplify the record with the particular linguistic precision of a man who wants to accomplish something he cannot say directly. Edward had declined. Julian had informed him that his services to the family were no longer required. He had then told Martha, apparently at some point in the weeks after Arthur's death, in one of the passing references she had accepted without examining that Edward had retired and moved away. Martha said, "He thought you'd be gone before I thought to look for you." Edward said, "That was the intention, yes." She reached into her bag. She took out the blue ledger and set it on the desk between them. Then she took out the sealed envelope, Arthur's handwriting, Edward Sloane's name, and placed it beside the ledger. Edward looked at the envelope for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of a feeling that has been held in waiting for a long time and has just been given permission to arrive. He said, "Arthur told me you'd come." He said it quietly, with the conviction of a man reporting something he had believed for 3 years. He said, "You'd know when it was time." She said, "What did Arthur tell you?" Edward said, "He told me to keep the red one safe. He said the blue one would find its way to you, and when it did, you'd bring it here." He stood from his desk. He went to the small safe in the corner of the room, visible unlocked. The door swung open on a collection of folders and envelopes and the carefully maintained records of a man who had decided years ago that certain things needed to be kept somewhere Julian could not reach them. He took out a ledger, red cover, cloth-bound, the same size and format as the blue one. He set it on the desk beside the blue one. They sat side by side on the cluttered surface, 2 halves of something visibly related, the matching spines of a record that had been deliberately divided and distributed to 2 different people in 2 different locations so that neither half alone was complete. Edward said, "The blue one is the map." He tapped it once gently. "This one is the destination." Martha looked at the 2 ledgers side by side. She thought about Arthur on the coast pointing to the smaller light on the lighthouse, the one that tells you where you actually are. She said, "Open it." Edward sat down and opened the red ledger to the first page, and Martha leaned forward in her chair in the small, cramped office of a man Julian had tried to make disappear, with the rain still coming down outside and the sound of it on the window, and she began to understand what Arthur had spent the last years of his life quietly, carefully, lovingly building for her. Edward opened the blue ledger to the first page. The entries began in the year the primary trust had been established 30 years ago, before Arthur had met Martha, before the second marriage, before the 28 years of breakfasts at the long table and Sunday mornings with the paper and the garden along the south wall. The handwriting was Arthur's throughout the same deliberate script she had been reading for decades. The figures entered with the precision of a man who had kept his own records because he trusted his own records more than anyone else's. Edward turned the pages, slowly narrating what she was seeing in the steady, unhurried way of a man who has known what these pages contained for 3 years and has thought carefully about how to explain them. The blue ledger was a record. Every significant expenditure Arthur had made on the property and the business holdings after the primary trust was created, documented, dated, categorized. Renovations to the house, capital improvements to the commercial wing, maintenance, landscaping, the new roof in 2019, years of careful investment in a property that the primary trust listed as belonging to his blood heirs. She said, "Why was he keeping this record?" Edward said, "Because he was building a case. The way a good attorney builds a case, before it's needed, before there's a conflict, before anyone is paying attention. He was documenting his contribution to an asset he knew would be contested." He closed the blue ledger and set it to the side. He opened the red one. The sub-trust had been executed 5 years ago. Edward explained it with the methodical clarity of a man who has explained complex legal structures before and knows that the clarity of the explanation matters as much as the content of it. He drew a simple diagram on a notepad as he spoke 2 boxes connected by an arrow, the way you explain a transfer. The primary trust, he said, held the title to the house and the commercial property. Julian and Chloe were co-trustees. This was what Julian had presented to Martha, and it was real, and it was accurate as far as it went. What it did not include was what Arthur had done 5 years ago. Arthur had negotiated the sale of the primary property from the primary trust to a newly created instrument. The sale price was $1 a nominal consideration legally sufficient, designed to complete the transfer without triggering tax implications that would have drawn attention. The new instrument was a sub-trust. Edward turned the red ledger to the relevant page and set it in front of her. The name of the sub-trust was printed at the top in Arthur's careful handwriting and then typed below it in the formal language of the legal document that had been registered with the county 5 years ago and had been sitting in Edward Sloane's safe ever since. The Martha Vance Life Estate. She read it twice. Edward said, "A life estate gives you the right to occupy and control the property for the duration of your natural life, not as a guest, not as a tenant, as the legal life tenant with full authority over the use of the property, the right to any income generated by the commercial wings, and the right to exclude others from the premises at your discretion." She said, "Julian and Chloe." He said, "They hold the remainder interest. When your life estate concludes, the title passes to them. But until then, and this is the critical point, Martha, the property is yours to live in and control. Julian cannot sell it. He cannot lease it. He cannot renovate it, modify it, or use it in any way without your written consent. And he cannot ask you to leave." She sat with that for a moment. 28 years of living in a house she had been told was not hers. 28 years of being careful, of being grateful, of occupying the space of a guest who understood her invitation might be temporary. And Arthur had been sitting in the study for the last 5 years with a document in his safe that said she was never a guest at all. She said, "He never told me." Edward said he was afraid if he told you, you would tell Julian. Not to be cruel, because that's who you are, Martha. He said you would have thought it was fair for Julian to know, and Julian knowing would have given Julian 5 years to find a way around it. She heard the truth of that. She heard Arthur in it, his specific knowledge of her, the way he had always been able to see the places where her generosity could be used against her, and had quietly built around them. She said, "Is there more?" Edward turned to the next section of the red ledger. There was a penalty clause. Arthur had included it in the subtrust instrument with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years watching estates contested and families fracture, and the intentions of careful people dismantled by the speed and aggression of people who cared more about the outcome than the principle. He had seen it enough times to know that a document without consequence was a suggestion, not a protection. The clause was clear. If the remainder beneficiaries Julian and Chloe named explicitly took any action to interfere with the life tenant's use and enjoyment of the property, including but not limited to eviction proceedings, removal of property harassment, or legal challenge without merit, the remainder interest would be forfeit. The title would revert entirely and permanently to Martha as the life tenant in a fee simple, without condition. Not for the duration of her life, permanently hers. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Edward. "He said he didn't just give you the house, Martha. He gave Julian a rope, and Julian just skipped right into the knot." She thought about the cardboard box. The 24-hour notice delivered 3 days after the funeral. Julian standing in the foyer of the house she had lived in for 28 years, handing her a box with the casual authority of a man who believed he had already won. The eviction notice. She said, "The notice he gave me." Edward nodded. He said formal eviction proceedings initiated within 72 hours of Arthur's death. It's documented, the notice itself is dated, signed, witnessed. It meets every requirement of the penalty clause. Martha Julian has already done it. He just didn't know what he was doing when he did it. She sat very still in the small, cramped office with the rain on the window and the 2 ledgers on the desk and the legal shape of what Arthur had built, becoming clear to her the way a structure becomes clear when you finally understand its plan. Sometimes the best way to see a person's heart is to let them think they've already won. He had said that by the fireplace one winter evening, smiling to himself at something she hadn't known he was thinking about. She had asked him what he was smiling at, and he had said nothing particular, just a thought, and had reached over and taken her hand and held it. He had been thinking about this. Edward said, "There's one more thing." He opened the back cover of the red ledger. Taped to the inside back cover was a small plastic sleeve. Inside the sleeve, a USB drive. Small black, the kind used for document storage, the kind Arthur would have known how to use because Arthur had always made the effort to learn whatever tools were available. He said, "I haven't listened to it. He told me not to. He said it was for you." He placed the drive on the desk in front of her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took the laptop from the corner of Edward's desk because he was already turning it toward her, and she inserted the drive and she opened the single file it contained. The video was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. Arthur's face filled the screen. He was sitting in his study chair, the chair she had sat in the night before, the chair she had always thought of as his chair, in the specific way that certain objects become so associated with a person they almost carry the person's presence. He looked tired in the video, the tiredness of the last years, but his eyes were clear and direct, and entirely themselves, those particular eyes she had looked into 10,000 times and had never stopped finding something new in. He said, "Martha, if you're watching this, you found the key. I knew you would. You always looked more carefully than people gave you credit for." His voice filled the small office. Edward had gone very still in his chair. Arthur spoke for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He explained the subtrust in his own words, simply the way he explained everything important, as if the person he was talking to deserved clarity and he was going to provide it. He named Julian and Chloe directly. He said he loved his children and he understood them, which was a different thing from approving of what he knew they would do. He said he had tried more than once to have the conversation with Julian that might have made this document unnecessary, and had not been able to find the version of that conversation that ended well, and had eventually concluded that protection was more reliable than persuasion. He said the drawer was a test, Ellie. I needed to know what Julian would do when he thought I wasn't watching. Martha looked at Edward. Edward said quietly, "The desk lamp." She thought about the lamp. Arthur's desk lamp, the brass one, the one that had been on that desk for as long as she had known him, that she had never thought to look at as anything other than what it appeared to be. Edward pulled up a secondary file on the laptop, a video file time-stamped 2 days after Arthur's death. The camera angle was from the desk lamp looking down at the desk surface and the locked bottom drawer. The footage was clear. You could see Julian's hands on the keyring working through the keys. You could see the letter opener. You could see his palm come down on the desk surface. You could hear him say, "Old junk." You could see everything. Arthur had installed the camera himself. He had been watching his desk from a lamp for long enough to ensure that whatever happened after he was gone, there would be a record of it. Martha looked at the footage for a long moment. She said he saw everything. Edward said he always did. She looked at the USB drive on the desk, at the 2 ledgers, at the rain on the window of the small office where a man had kept Arthur's secret safe for 3 years because Arthur had trusted him to, and because some people, when trusted by a person of genuine character, do not let that trust down. She thought about Arthur sitting in the study in the evenings with the lamp on, looking toward the door, holding everything he had built in his careful hands and waiting for the right moment to set it down. He had set it down for her. She straightened in her chair. She said, "What do we do first?" Edward Sloane picked up his pen. The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time Martha turned onto the familiar road. She had driven back the way she had driven out 2 hours the same route, the same gray sky, pressing down over the same landscape of small towns and bare fields, and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road. But the quality of the drive was different now. On the way out, she had been carrying uncertainty, the particular unmoored feeling of a woman who has found something she doesn't yet understand. On the way back, she was carrying something that had weight and shape and direction. Edward sat in the passenger seat with his briefcase on his lap and looked at the road ahead without speaking, which was the right thing to do. He had understood from their time in his office that Martha was a woman who needed silence to think and did not need to fill it with reassurance. And he respected that the way you respect something that tells you clearly what it is. She had called Clara from the car before they left the coastal town. Clara had answered on the second ring with the alert attention of a woman who had been waiting for 3 days for a call that told her something had shifted. Martha had said, "I'm going back to the house." Clara had said, "I'll meet you there." Martha had said, "Give me an hour first." Clara had said, "Understood." Then, "Are you all right?" Martha had said, "I think Arthur made sure I would be." She parked on the street rather than the driveway. It was a small decision, a practical one. She did not want the sound of her car on the gravel to announce her before she was ready. She and Edward walked to the front door in the light rain, and she put her key in the lock. Her key, the one she had carried on her keyring for 28 years that no one had thought to ask for because no one had thought she would come back and open the door. The entry hall was as she had left it that morning. The foyer she had stood in with a cardboard box and a 24-hour notice. The banister she had steadied herself on. The space where the Christmas wreaths had hung. From the sitting room came the sound of voices. Julian and Chloe talking in the easy proprietary way of people who have concluded a difficult thing and are now enjoying the conclusion. The particular clink of good glassware. She walked to the sitting room doorway. Julian was on the sofa with Arthur's scotch, the good one, the one Arthur kept on the shelf above the fireplace, for specific occasions, the one he had opened on their 20th anniversary and their 25th, and the evening Martha had told him she had been asked to speak at the state education conference, and he had said he knew she would be asked eventually, and they should mark the moment. Julian had poured it into one of the crystal glasses from the cabinet, and was holding it with the ease of a man in a room he considers his. Chloe was beside him with her phone and her own glass, looking at something on the screen with the half-attention of a person who is present in a room without being fully in it. Julian looked up. His expression moved through annoyance and arrived at condescension in about 2 seconds. He said, "Forgot something, Martha." "You have 10 minutes before I call the—" He stopped. Edward Sloane had stepped through the door behind her. The change in Julian's face was not subtle. The condescension left first. The color followed. What remained was the specific pallor of a man who has been certain of something and has just encountered information that makes the certainty untenable. He said, "Edward." His voice had lost its forward momentum. He said, "You're supposed to be in Florida." Edward set his briefcase on the entry table and opened it with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has been waiting 3 years for this specific morning. He said, "I prefer the rain, Julian, especially when it's washing away a fraudulent eviction." He walked past Julian to the coffee table and set the blue ledger down on its surface with the deliberate placement of a man presenting evidence rather than making an argument. Then he set the red ledger beside it. Then the document, the subtrust instrument, the Martha Vance Life Estate County, registered notarized, dated 5 years ago, by a man who had understood exactly what he was building and had built it to last. Chloe had put her phone down. She was looking at the ledgers on the table with an expression Martha recognized not guilt, not remorse, but the specific focused attention of a woman calculating her position and not yet knowing what she is calculating toward. Julian said, "Those documents don't change anything. The primary trust." Edward said, "The primary trust transferred the property to the subtrust 5 years ago for a consideration of $1. It's a matter of public record at the county recorder's office. I filed the original myself. Julian, the primary trust doesn't govern this property anymore. It hasn't for 5 years." Julian said, "That's not possible. Our attorney reviewed." Edward said, "Your attorney reviewed the records you gave him access to. He looked at what you put in front of him. He did not pull the full property record from the county because you told him the primary trust was the governing instrument, and he took you at your word. He picked up the subtrust document and turned to the specific page and set it back on the table facing Julian. He said, 'This is a life estate. Martha has the legal right to occupy and control this property for the duration of her natural life. She has the right to all income from the commercial wings. She has the right to exclude others from the premises, including you.'" Chloe reached forward and took the document from the table. Edward said without raising his voice, "I wouldn't read the next page before you've put that one down, Chloe, but I would strongly suggest you not take it further than your own hands. It's evidence relevant to a potential breach of trust proceeding, and removing it from this room would compound a problem you haven't fully understood yet." Chloe set it down. Julian said, "What problem?" Edward turned to the second document. He said the subtrust contains a penalty clause. If the remainder beneficiaries, that's you and your sister, take action to interfere with the life tenant's use and enjoyment of the property, the remainder interest is forfeit. The title reverts to Martha in fee simple, permanently. He picked up the eviction notice, the one Julian had handed Martha 3 days ago, in this same foyer, dated and signed and witnessed with the confident efficiency of a man who believed he was completing an uncomplicated transaction. He set it on top of the ledger. He said, "You served this notice 71 hours after Arthur's death. It's dated, signed in your hand, witnessed by your attorney, and it meets every requirement of the breach clause. Julian, you triggered the penalty before Martha had finished packing." The room was very quiet. Julian looked at the eviction notice. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they produced and are now seeing from a completely different angle. The way you look at something you were certain was an asset and are being shown is a liability. The way you look at a rope you walked into thinking it was a door. He said you can't. Edward said, "It's already done. The clause is self-executing. The breach occurred the moment the notice was served. The reversion is a matter of documenting the event, which we have now done in this room with 2 witnesses. Martha, would you like to take the notice?" Martha walked forward. She took the eviction notice from the coffee table. She looked at it, at Julian's signature, at the date, at the formal language of a document that had been intended to end her life in this house, and had instead, by the precise operation of a mechanism Arthur had installed and Julian had walked into with the unthinking confidence of a man who had never considered he might be wrong, done the opposite. She folded it once. She said, "I'll keep this as a souvenir." She put it in her cardigan pocket alongside the brass key and the dry fountain pen. She looked at Julian. He was still on the sofa, his scotch glass in his hand, the color not yet fully returned to his face. He looked for the first time since the funeral like a man who did not know what came next. She said, "You said the legacy belonged to the Vances, Julian. You were right. But Arthur decided I was more of a Vance than you'll ever be. She said it without heat, without triumph. In the same quiet, even register she had used in every difficult room she had ever sat in, steady clear the voice of a woman who has known who she is for a long time and has not needed the room's agreement to continue knowing it. Chloe said, "There has to be a way to—" Edward said, "There isn't. I've spent 3 years making sure of that," Julian said finally in a voice that had lost all of its morning's authority. "He planned this. He planned the whole thing." Martha looked at the study doorway, at the desk she could see through it, at the lamp on the corner of the desk. She said, "Yes, he did." Edward walked to the study doorway. He turned on the desk lamp. He pointed to the lamp housing to the small, almost invisible lens in the brass fitting at the base, the one that looked like a design element and was something else entirely. "He said he installed the camera himself, Julian. 2 years ago. He told me it was there so he could check the study remotely when he traveled. That was partly true. He also wanted a record of what happened to his desk after he was gone." Julian looked at the lamp. "Edward said we have the footage of you trying to force the drawer, the letter opener, the impact on the desktop. Arthur knew you wouldn't be able to resist. He was counting on it. Sometimes the best way to see a person's heart is to let them think they've already won." Martha stood in the foyer, the same light, but not the same woman who had stood here 3 days ago with a cardboard box and a 24-hour notice. That woman had been wounded and steady and carrying something she didn't yet understand. This woman understood. She looked at the entry hall around her, at the banister she had steadied herself on, at the space where the Christmas wreaths had hung, at the door Arthur had walked through 10,000 times. She was home. She had always been home. Arthur had simply made sure that the paperwork finally said what the truth had always been. Julian's lawyer arrived at noon. He was a different man from the one who had prepared the estate documents, younger, sharper, the kind of attorney who specialized in the aggressive end of property disputes and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had won enough of those disputes to believe he would win the next one. He came through the front door with his briefcase and his assessment already forming, nodding briefly at Julian in the way of a professional signaling that he has the situation under control. Edward showed him to the study. Martha sat in the sitting room with Chloe, who had put her phone away and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a woman doing rapid, internal calculations. Martha did not speak to her. She sat in the chair by the window, Arthur's chair, the one that looked out over the rose bed, and waited with the patience of a woman who had learned over a long life that certain things resolved themselves if you gave them the right amount of time and did not interfere with the process. From the study came the low, indistinct sound of 2 attorneys talking, not arguing, talking with the focused professional brevity of people who understand the same language and are using it to establish facts rather than contest them. Edward's voice measured and unhurried, the other voice shorter in its responses, the rhythm of a man receiving information and reassessing. After 10 minutes, Julian's lawyer came out of the study. He walked to the sofa where Julian was sitting and stood in front of him. He said without preamble, "Sit down, Julian." Julian said, "I am sitting down." His lawyer said, "Then stay sitting down." He pulled the ottoman from beside Arthur's reading chair and sat across from Julian at eye level, which was the position of a man about to deliver something his client was not going to want to hear, and wanted to deliver it without the authority differential of standing over him. Martha had seen this posture before in hospital corridors and meeting rooms, and she recognized it for what it was, the professional equivalent of bracing someone before an impact. He spoke to Julian quietly. Martha did not try to hear the words. She didn't need to. She could read the shape of the conversation in Julian's face as it progressed, the initial resistance, the leaning forward to object the lawyer's steady continuation, and then the particular stillness that arrived when a man has heard something that removes his remaining options and is processing the removal. Julian looked at the study doorway, at the desk visible through it and the lamp on its corner and the bottom right drawer that was closed now but had given up what it contained. He looked at the drawer for a long time. Martha stood up. She moved to the center of the room, the same furniture, the same afternoon light coming through the windows she had cleaned 100 times. She waited until Julian looked at her. "She said you have a choice. I want to explain it to you clearly because Arthur would have wanted clarity over confusion even now." Julian said nothing. His lawyer sat beside him with the stillness of a man who has advised his client to listen. "Martha said Edward will file the formal documentation of the breach and the reversion of title. That is happening regardless of what you decide. The property is mine. That part is not a choice, it's already done." She said the choice is what comes next. You can leave today quietly and retain what the primary trust originally gave you. Your original inheritance, the financial accounts, the investment portfolio, the contents of the primary trust that were never part of the subtrust. That stands. Arthur set it aside for you deliberately. It's real and it's yours, and I have no intention of touching it. She paused. She said, "Or you can instruct your attorney to challenge the subtrust. That process will take years and will cost more than the primary inheritance is worth, and it will require you to explain to a court why you suppressed Edward Sloane's involvement in the estate review and why you served an eviction notice 3 days after your father's funeral on a property you did not legally own. That explanation will be made on the record, in public, with the security footage and the ledgers and the county filing all entered as exhibits." She said, "I'm not doing this for revenge, Julian. I'm doing it because Arthur wanted this house to be a home, and you only saw it as an asset." The room was quiet. Julian looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the aggressive confidence of the man who had handed her a cardboard box, not the managed composure of the man who had presented the trust documents at the dining table. Something underneath both of those things, something younger and less defended. He said, "Where was the key?" It was not quite a question, more the last inquiry of a man trying to understand a thing that had defeated him. Martha reached up and touched the chain at her collar. She had threaded the brass key onto it that morning in Edward's office with a length of chain she had found in her bag, a practical woman's solution to the problem of carrying something small and important. The key rested against her collarbone, now small and warm. She smiled. She did not answer. Julian looked at it for a moment. Then he looked away. Chloe had been crying since the lawyer sat down with Julian. Not quietly, with the specific, effortful sound of a woman who is not accustomed to crying and is finding the experience both genuine and deeply inconvenient. She had her designer bag in her lap and her phone face down beside her, and she was crying in the way of someone who is mourning not a loss of love, but a loss of expectation, the particular grief of a person who had already in her mind spent what she believed she was about to receive. Julian's lawyer stood and said something brief to Julian about next steps. Julian nodded without looking up. Then Julian stood. He was quieter than Martha had seen him in 3 days. The forward momentum was gone, that characteristic energy of a man in motion, always moving toward the next thing he had decided he needed. He looked at the room, at the furniture, at the shelves of books with their contents he had cataloged and labeled and planned to disperse. He picked up his briefcase. He said to the room rather than to Martha specifically, "I didn't know about the subtrust." "Martha said I know." He said he should have told me. "She said he tried Julian. More than once. You weren't ready to hear it." She said it gently because it was true, and because gentleness was what the truth deserved in this moment, and because Arthur had loved his son in the imperfect, complicated way of fathers who see their children clearly and love them anyway. Julian didn't respond. He walked to the foyer. Chloe followed her bag over her arm. Her crying subsided to the periodic, unsteady breath of someone who has exhausted the immediate supply. Martha walked behind them. At the entry table beside the foyer mirror, the porcelain vase stood in its place, the cream-colored one with the hand-painted blue flowers, the one Arthur had carried from the shop himself on their first anniversary, and set on that table and said, "This is where it lives now." Chloe's sticky note was still on it. The word donation in Chloe's rounded handwriting replaced by estate pending review, which now meant nothing at all. Martha reached out and peeled the note from the vase. She held it out to Julian. He looked at it. He took it from her hand. He looked at it for a moment longer, that small pink square, that small confident word written by someone who had walked through this house putting labels on a life they had never understood. He put it in his coat pocket. He opened the front door. Chloe went first. He followed. He stopped in the doorway. Without turning around, he said, "He built all of this for you. He spent years building it." Martha said, "Yes." Julian said he never built anything like that for us. She stood for a moment with that sentence, with the weight of it, the real weight, the grief inside it that had nothing to do with ledgers or legal clauses or a locked drawer in a walnut desk. She said, "He loved you, Julian. He just knew you differently than he knew me, and he protected what he loved in the way he understood how." Julian stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he walked out into the drizzle. She watched them go, Julian and Chloe crossing the gravel drive to their cars, getting indoors, closing engines, starting. The sound of tires on the wet gravel, then the road, then nothing. She turned back to the foyer. The entry hall was quiet around her. The vase on its table, the banister at the stair, the light from the windows falling on the surfaces she knew the way you know things you have lived with for a long time, without effort, without thinking, in the way knowing becomes part of you. A man's worth isn't in what he takes, but in what he leaves for those who stay. She touched the brass key at her collar. She was staying. The house was quiet again. Not the heavy-weighted quiet of the days after the funeral, when Arthur's absence had pressed against every surface, and the rooms had felt like they were holding their breath. This was a different quiet, the quiet of a house that has been through something difficult and has come out the other side into something calmer, the quiet of a place that knows what it is again. Martha stood in the study doorway for a long moment before she went in. The desk was as she had left it the night she found the key. The lamp in its corner, the leather blotter, the row of reference books along the back edge. The bottom right drawer was closed. She had not locked it again. She had not needed to. What it had held had been given over to the world the way secrets are meant to be given over when the right time finally comes. She sat down in Arthur's chair. She sat there for a while without doing anything, the way she had sat in that chair the night of the key and the night of the ledgers, and the morning after Julian and Chloe had driven away in the drizzle. She was learning in these weeks that the chair was where she came to think that it had become somehow the place where she felt most clearly the particular quality of Arthur's presence, the way certain spaces retain the character of the people who inhabited them long enough and completely enough. She said to the room, to the desk, to the lamp with its small hidden eye that had watched and recorded and kept faith with Arthur's careful planning, "You were always a step ahead, Arthur. Thank you for waiting for me." The room held the words, the way old rooms hold things without judgment, without echo, simply present. The work of restoration took several weeks. She did it methodically, the way she did everything that mattered, not quickly, not all at once, but in the deliberate sequence of a person who understands that undoing damage is its own kind of work and deserves the same attention as anything built forward. She went through the house room by room and removed every sticky note. She took them down one by one, the sell labels and the keep labels and the estate pending review labels, and placed them in a pile on the kitchen counter and then put them in the recycling bin with the particular satisfaction of a woman disposing of something that had briefly had power and no longer did. The vase went back to its place on the entry table. The sideboard was where it had always been. The hall mirror reflected the foyer the way it had reflected it for 28 years. The piano came back from the garage on a Wednesday morning. She had hired 2 men to move it, and she had supervised the process with the focused attention of someone overseeing the transport of something irreplaceable, which it was. When it was back in its place in the sitting room, the specific place it had occupied for 28 years, the place where the afternoon light fell on the keys in a particular way that she had always found beautiful without ever articulating why she sat down on the bench and put her hands on the keys and played. Not something complicated, not something performed, just a simple piece she had known since she was 7 years old, the first piece her teacher had given her that had a real melody, a piece she had played 10,000 times in her life, and that still reliably felt like the purest form of being herself. The music moved through the house the way music moves through a house that has been waiting for it, filling the rooms, touching the walls, going up the staircase, and into the study, and out through the windows into the garden, where the rose bed was beginning to show the first green of the season. She played until she was ready to stop. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and listened to the silence that music leaves behind, which is a different silence from any other kind. The other things Arthur had left came slowly, the way he had done everything that mattered without announcement at the pace that was right, rather than the pace that was convenient. The letter was in the pocket of his winter coat. She found it in early May when she was going through the closet with the practical intention of deciding what to keep and what to give away, and her hand went into the pocket of the heavy gray coat he had worn for 15 years and found an envelope with her name on it. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it twice, and then folded it and held it against her chest for a long time, the way she had held the note from the photograph frame on the night she found the key. The pressed flower was in a book she had not opened since before Arthur's illness, a collection of poems she had given him on an early anniversary, which he had read and returned to the shelf with the bookmark still in it. When she opened it, a small dried flower fell from between the pages, a rose. From the garden, she thought the particular deep red of the roses along the south wall. No note, just the flower placed there by his hands at some point in some quiet moment for her to find. She was understanding in these weeks that the locked drawer had not been only a legal instrument. It had been one gesture among many, the most urgent, the most carefully constructed, the one that had required brass cylinders and sub-trusses and camera lenses and desk lamps. But it had been continuous with these other gestures, the letter in the coat and the flower in the book and the key hidden behind the track photograph. It had all been the same act performed in different registers, the act of a man who had loved his wife for 28 years and had found in his own particular way as many different means of saying so as he could. She thought about what he had said by the fireplace one winter evening. "Life isn't about the destination, Martha. It's about making sure the people you love have a safe place to rest when they get there." He had been building her a safe place, all along in all the ways he knew how. The foundation had been Edward's suggestion offered carefully, in the way he offered things as information rather than instruction, as a possibility rather than a prescription. He had said, "Arthur told me once that what bothered him most about the way estates were handled was what happened to women who hadn't planned for the fight, women who assumed good faith and found something else. He said he wished there was somewhere for them to go." Martha had listened. Then she had said, "Let's build it." They had spent several evenings at the dining table with the foundation paperwork spread between them, working through the structure of it the way she had once worked through school district budgets, carefully, completely making sure the architecture was right before anything was built on top of it. The Arthur Vance Foundation for Housing Security. Support for older women facing housing displacement, legal resources, emergency housing assistance, the practical infrastructure of getting through a difficult thing when you are doing it alone. She had signed the incorporation documents on a Tuesday afternoon in May and called Clara on the way home. She found the photograph on a Thursday. She had been going through the back of the drawer, the papers beneath the ledger which she had set aside during the urgency of the previous weeks, and was now returning to with the unhurried attention they deserved. Most were documents. A few were personal. At the very back, in a small envelope, a photograph of Julian. He was perhaps 8 years old. Standing in this garden, she could see the rose bed behind him, smaller than newly planted, squinting into the sun, with the expression of a child who has been asked to hold still for a camera and is finding it difficult. Arthur must have taken it. The photo had the quality of a candid, not posed, not performed just a child in a garden on an ordinary afternoon, caught in the act of being himself. On the back, in Arthur's handwriting, Julian Summer, 1984. Good day. She sat with the photograph for a long time. She thought about what Julian had said in the doorway. "He never built anything like that for us." She thought about the weight of that sentence and what it held 30 years of a son, watching his father build something careful and lasting for a woman who was not his mother, and feeling in that watching the specific wound of believing he had been loved less. She did not think Arthur had loved Julian less. She thought Arthur had loved Julian differently in the complicated way of a man who understood his son's weaknesses clearly and did not know how to protect him from them, without removing the consequences that might eventually teach him something. She put the photograph in the inside pocket of her cardigan near her heart. She would send it to Julian, not with a letter, not with an explanation, just the photograph of a boy in a garden on a good day. He could do with it what he needed to. Clara came on Sunday. They sat in the garden in the late afternoon in the 2 chairs Martha had moved to the south side near the rose bed with tea, and the particular ease of 2 women who have known each other their whole lives and do not need to account for every silence. Clara looked at the garden, at the house, at Martha beside her with the brass key on its chain, at her collar and the quietness of a woman who has come through something and arrived somewhere real. She said, "You look different." Martha said, "I feel different." Clara said, "How?" Martha looked at the rose bed, at the old oak at the property line, at the house behind them, its windows catching the last of the afternoon sun, the piano visible through the sitting room glass. She said, "I don't feel like a guest anymore." Clara reached over and took her hand. They sat in the garden until the light changed and the evening came and the house behind them held its quiet, around them warm and permanent and entirely hers. A year later, the house was full of laughter, not the careful managed laughter of people performing ease in a room they are uncertain about, but the real kind, the warm, overlapping laughter of women who have found themselves in a room where they are genuinely welcome and are allowing themselves to feel it. Martha had set the dining table with the good dishes and opened the windows to the May evening and made 3 kinds of food she had not made since before Arthur's illness, because cooking for people you want to feed is one of the oldest and most honest forms of saying you matter to me. The foundation had helped 11 women in its first year. 6 of them were here tonight. Martha moved through the rooms, the way a woman moves through a house she has inhabited long enough to know it completely, without thinking, without navigating, simply present in it, the way you are present in a place that has become part of how you understand yourself. She refilled glasses and introduced people to each other and listened to the conversations that had started and were going places she hadn't planned, which was the best kind of gathering. At some point, she found herself standing in the foyer. She was not sure how she had gotten there, exactly one of those small, unplanned moments when a room deposits you somewhere without your noticing the motion. She stood near the staircase and looked at the banister. She had steadied herself on it a year ago. Julian standing in this same foyer, the cardboard box, the 24-hour notice, the color of that morning. She had put her hand on the banister and found it solid and held on. She looked at it now and understood something she had not understood then. The banister had not held her up. She had held herself up. The banister had simply been what her hand found. The steadiness had been hers. Hers in the long accumulated way of a woman who has navigated difficult rooms for 72 years and has built through that navigation something durable in herself that does not depend on external support to function. Arthur had known that. He had built his protection not by removing difficulty from her path, but by ensuring that when the difficulty arrived, she had what she needed to move through it herself. The key behind the photograph, the ledger in the drawer, the name Edward Sloane written in a note she would find when she was ready to find it. He had not rescued her. He had equipped her and trusted her and left her the path. That was the thing she had been understanding slowly in the years since, in the way that the deepest understandings arrive not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing the next. She went to the study. The party continued warmly behind her. She could hear it, the voices and the laughter and the sound of the piano, because Clara had sat down at it an hour ago and had not fully stopped playing, the way Clara had always played, with more enthusiasm than precision and all the right feeling. Martha had always loved listening to Clara play. The study was quiet. The desk lamp was on. She left it on in the evenings now, a habit she had formed without deciding to the small warm circle of it, a presence she had come to rely on. The bottom right drawer was open. She had kept it open since the day after Julian and Chloe left, when she had come into the study in the early morning and looked at the drawer and decided without quite articulating the decision that a drawer that had spent years being a secret should spend the rest of its time being useful. It held her letters to Arthur now. She had begun writing them in the months after the legal matters were concluded, not because she expected a response, but because she had discovered that writing to him was a form of continuing the conversation, and she was not ready to stop the conversation. The letters were in a small bundle tied with kitchen twine sitting against the left side of the drawer. Beside them, photographs. The faces of the women the foundation had helped. She printed them herself one by one and added them to the drawer as they arrived, so that the thing that had held Arthur's protection for her now held her protection for others. It seemed right. It seemed like the kind of continuity Arthur would have appreciated. And at the back of the drawer in its small envelope, the photograph of Julian at 8 years old, squinting into the sun in the garden. She had made a copy before she sent the original to his last known address. She had not heard back. She had not expected to, not yet. Some things took longer than a year. She said his name once quietly in the way she had come to say things she was not ready to say aloud to another person, just speaking them into the room, into the lamp's warm circle, into the space where his presence was still most palpable. She said I sent him the photograph. The room held the statement without response, which was its own kind of response. A young woman appeared in the study doorway. Martha had met her 3 months ago through the foundation, recently widowed, recently displaced, navigating the same territory. Martha had navigated a year ago with the same combination of dignity and bewilderment that the territory seemed to produce in women who had never expected to be on it. She had a quality of careful composure that Martha recognized from the inside. She said I wanted to find you and say thank you, properly, not in a card. Martha said, "Come in." The young woman came into the study and looked around at the desk and the books and the lamp with its warm circle. She said, "Was this his?" Martha said, "Yes." She said, "It feels like him. I don't know how to explain that." Martha said, "You don't have to explain it." The young woman looked at the open drawer and the photographs and the bundle of letters. She said, "You kept it open." Martha said it was meant to hold things. Keeping it locked seemed like a waste. The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know how you did it. Any of it." Martha thought about the question, about the brass key on its chain, about the ledgers on Edward's desk, about the morning she had stood in the rain on the front porch of the house that was hers and had always been hers, about Arthur's voice in the video, tired and clear and entirely himself, about the oilcloth and the hollow beam and the lighthouse and the smaller light that tells you where you actually are. She took the young woman's hand and held it for a moment. She said, "Always check the bottom." The young woman looked at her. Martha smiled. The young woman squeezed her hand and went back to the party, and Martha could hear the shift in her step, something fractionally lighter, the way a step becomes lighter when a person has been given something small but solid to carry. The party wound down gently, the way good gatherings do not abruptly, but with the gradual, satisfied diminishment of people who have had enough of the right thing and are ready to take it home with them. Martha stood at the door and said goodbye to each person with the full attention of a woman who understands that being seen is one of the things people need most and costs least to give. Clara was the last to leave. She stood in the doorway in her coat with her keys in her hand and looked at Martha with the expression of a woman who has been her sister's witness for 70 years and does not need words for most of what she wants to say. She said he chose well. Martha said we both did. Clara squeezed her arm and went down the porch steps and got in her car and drove away, and Martha stood in the doorway and watched the taillights until they were gone. She stood for a moment in the quiet of the finished evening. Then she went to the study and stood at the desk and looked at the open drawer one last time. She reached in and took out the brass key. She held it in her palm, small, warm from the drawer's interior, the particular weight of a thing that had done its work and was now resting. She looked at the track photograph on the wall. Arthur at 17, mid-stride the finish line ahead of him, that expression of focused and committed motion she had recognized across 40 years and known immediately as the truest image of who he was. She lifted the frame from the wall. She opened the backing. She placed the key against the cardboard exactly where she had found it and taped it in place with a strip of tape from the desk drawer. She replaced the backing. She hung the frame back on its nail. She stood and looked at it. She did not know who would find it next or when or what they would need it for. She knew that Arthur had understood something about the way protection works, that it moves forward, that it compounds, that a thing built with enough love continues to function long after the builder is gone. She understood it now, too. She had learned it the way she had learned everything important in her adult life, by living it, by being present for it, by paying attention. They saw an old woman and an old house. They didn't see the love that held every brick together. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked through the quiet house, through the study and the hallway and the sitting room, where the piano stood in its place with the last of the evening light on its keys, and out to the porch. She sat in the chair that faced the garden. The roses along the south wall were in their first bloom of the season, the deep red ones Arthur had planted the year they married, reliable as anything she had ever known. The oak at the property line stood in the last of the light, enormous and unhurried, as it had stood before either of them and would stand after her. The house behind her was warm and lit and present. She sat on the porch in the May evening and breathed the air of the garden she had tended for 28 years and felt without effort, without reaching for it, the thing she had been feeling more and more in this year of restoration and foundation paperwork and letters to a man who could no longer write back. She felt at home, not because the legal documents said so, not because Edward Sloan had filed the right papers with the right county offices, not because Julian and Chloe had taken their original inheritance and their defeated expressions and driven away in the rain, because Arthur had been right. She was the house. She had always been the house. The love that held every brick together had been hers as much as his. Her 28 years of steadiness and attention, and the quiet, unglamorous faithfulness of a woman who had loved a man completely and had been loved the same way back in the careful, particular, planning-ahead way that was his nature, and that had turned out in the end to be its own most durable form of devotion. She touched the chain at her collar. The key was not there anymore. It was back behind the photograph waiting for whoever needed it next. She did not need it anymore. She had always had the thing the key was protecting. She just hadn't known it yet. The lights of the house were warm behind her, and the garden was quiet in the May evening, and Martha Vance sat on her porch in the last of the light and was completely and permanently home.